I've been playing Warhammer for decades, and I've amassed a sizable collection of miniatures consisting of half a dozen different armies. Some of these have gotten more use than others, but when 10th edition Warhammer 40k launched, I went all in on the hashtag new 40k and dusted off some of my lesser played forces. It finally felt like I could jump on board Warhammer again and have a lot of fun. I was excited for 10th edition because the previous edition had been a little bit of a bomb for me. It's no secret that Games Workshop's anti-consumer practices and general hostility towards the player base has alienated me over the last few years. But with 10th edition, Games Workshop were saying all the right things. They were whispering sweet words in my ear. Free rules, better gameplay, every faction updated all at once to be on the same power level. Okay, so they're not starting to credit their artists anytime soon, or paying their employees better, or reducing their reliance on FOMO marketing, or cutting their prices. But hey, alright, I've been arrested for shoplifting plenty of times. I'll take what I can get. And the best part of 10th edition, for me at least, was that every faction was getting its very own new special army rule that would define how it plays. This seemed like a really cool direction to take the game, and a nice simplified version of the 3 million faction rules that every single army seemed to have in 9th edition. And a lot of these rules were revealed, and they seemed pretty cool. But without a doubt, the army that I was most anticipating, the update that I dreamed of, was for the Gene Stealer cults. Yeah, for real. Okay, so most people are probably doing a Travolta impression right now. This is one of the lesser known armies in the game. You're not gonna see Gene Stealer cults on any faction posters or headlining for, I don't know, Steel Panther. Those guys are famous, right? Gene Stealer cults are really underrated, is my point. But that's undeserved, in my opinion, because I think that they're actually the best Warhammer army of all time, beating out fan favorites like Superman in Armor, and of course, Superman in Armor. In contrast to most other Warhammer armies, Gene Stealer cultists bring a certain you just stepped on an IED vibe that other armies don't really like. And that's because the Gene Stealer cultists are unique in that they are a homegrown rebel faction for the Imperium of Man. Okay, so maybe they're a little less homegrown and a little bit more imported, but hey, they're a rebel faction, and I've always had a soft spot for rebel factions. And this has nothing to do with the fact that I grew up in Northern Ireland, home of the world famous IRA. Okay, so it's probably directly related, but I love them. I love the militia vibe of the Gene Stealer cultists. I love their jerry-rigged civilian vehicles boosted for war, and I love their improvised weapons. The designers for the GSC surely knocked it out of the park when they came up with these little bad boys. And really, the faction represents something very special in 40k. They represent a part of the galaxy that we don't get to see very often. Plus, they have a whole weird Innsmouth lads on bikes thing going on, and who can argue with that? But while I love the army and their vibe, I've never been able to quite grok their playstyle. I mean, they play like how you would expect. They're an insurgency punching up against a militaristic empire. That's their theme, and their mechanics reflect that. Which is to say that they're engaged in a really difficult fight, and if you play them, then so are you. Notoriously, Gene Stealer cults are borderline unplayable in 40k. To give you a little bit of an idea, imagine you were commanding a glass cannon, but it's not a cannon, it's a dildo. Combine frailty with not a lot of firepower, and you're basically got the experience of playing the Gene Stealer cultists. In terms of gameplay, they're focused on ambushing the enemy at opportune moments, dealing some damage and then trying to get away. They make sacrifices where they have to in order to support a larger strategic plan. It's like you're playing chess, except your opponent's board is filled with queens and your side is filled with invisible pawns. Combine this with the fact that they're a horde army and they're really expensive to buy, and yeah, Gene Stealer cults are basically the least played faction in the entire game. I would go so far as to say that not only have most people not played as the Gene Stealer cultists, but most people haven't played against the Gene Stealer cultists. That's how rare they are. That is, until now. Because with 10th edition, the Genestealer Cultists got a whole new army rule, and oh baby, is it a beauty. Seriously, reading this army rule immediately got me to crack out my army out of the closet and get back to work, because it is genuinely the most fun army rule that I've ever played with in almost any war game ever. And I play more games than Warhammer, so you know, I'm well versed in wargaming. But what is it? What could have pulled me back to the cult? Well, it's an army rule called Cult Ambush, and it does this. Ahem. That's way too much text. Basically, when your unit dies, another one rises up to take its place. Boom! Endless waves of revolutionaries. What an awesome and unique rule. Now, there's some caveats to this. Hero units don't respawn, for example. Neither do tanks. Likewise, when a unit is respawning, you have to put a marker down on the board that the enemy can remove if they get close enough and they're smart about it, and this allows for some counterplay. This also creates an entirely new interaction on the board, and my games as Genestealer Cultists at the beginning of 10th edition were some of the most strategic games of Warhammer I've ever played, as my opponent and I fought over board control to determine whether or not my units would rise up even after death. And the rule is super thematic. It emphasizes that the Genestealer Cultists are a revolution. They are homegrown. When you're fighting the Genestealer Cultists, you're not just fighting some random guys, you're fighting a planet. You're not fighting over random ruins, you're fighting in the street. This may look like a mere tournament legal table, but actually, this is the local pub. This is where Fishy Joe had his first kiss, and this is where they hanged their first Imperial delegate. The world of 40k suddenly becomes real with Genestealer Cultists on the board, and Space Marines quickly learn that even when they kill one cultist, 10 more shall rise up from the ruins and take their place. This army rule absolutely rehabilitated the faction for a lot of people, and Genestealer Cultist players grew to a size never seen before. The GSC community has always been small, but a lot of new people joined at the beginning of 10th as a result of this new faction rule. And yes, this new faction rule did make the Genestealer Cultists more powerful, so that obviously accounts for some of the increase in players, but it also made them playable too. Suddenly the fact that the cultists died to a stiff breeze didn't matter so much when they would just simply get replaced and rejuvenated throughout the match. The faction truly finally felt like an actual revolution, with streams of armed revolutionaries storming the streets, ready to take it back from the oppressive Imperium, or Tau, or Orcs, or whatever. And for 2 months, I enjoyed a golden age of Genestealer Cultist play, and so did the competitive side of Warhammer. And Genestealers in 10th edition have been pretty strong. Not as strong as like the Eldar, but certainly they've been in the top 3 factions. And this is all because in a game where the meta had developed into a question of who can alpha strike their opponent firstest and hardest, a faction that continually responds throughout the game means that that traditional strategy just doesn't work. Extreme firepower is less useful against them, but mobility and tactical movement becomes so much more relevant in a game involving Genestealer Cultists. You want to remove their cult markers, allowing units to respawn from those points. And people struggled to change their playstyles to accommodate for this, which in fairness is pretty thematic to an asymmetric guerrilla war faction. This is no stand-up fight, ladies and gentlemen. Plus, you know, in 10th edition, Genestealer Cultists also got some pretty sweet upgrades. Their explosives were made even stronger, and they gained the ability to ambush out of reserve in a way no one else has seen before. So yeah, they basically played like the GLA in Command & Conquer Generals.
GLA Postal Service.
That game was a lot more problematic than I remember. Unfortunately though, all good things must come to an end, because Games Workshop noticed that people were having fun with a faction that didn't start with the letters L and end with the letters DAR. See, Warhammer 10th edition has had a really rough launch, in part due to the fact that the Eldar faction have been incredibly oppressively powerful, dominating the tournament scene, leading to a lot of gnashing of teeth. So Games Workshop had to recently rush out a balance patch to fix the game. And what happened kind of blew my mind, because Games Workshop took a massive nerf hammer, not to the Eldar, a faction that has been winning every single tournament over the last few months, a faction that can only lose to other Eldar, but instead to the Genestealer cultists, to a moderately powerful army that could actually counter Eldar. And this was a huge surprise to me. I knew that a little bit of a nerf was coming, but the size and severity of it was devastating. The nerf took the form of increasing points of Genestealer cultist units across the board. But not only that, they also completely destroyed the cult ambush army rule. Now, instead of units simply respawning during the next turn, instead the Genestealer cultist player has to roll a die every single time they lose one of their units, and only on a 5+ does the unit come back. A 5+. That is, let's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's very unlikely. And okay, that might not sound like a big, huge, sweeping change, but it has transformed the Genestealer cult army into one where if you lose a couple of dice rolls, suddenly your weak glass dildo units die, and then that's it. They might come back, they might not. It's super inconsistent, and you end up with shards all up in your orifices. And to be frank, this is bad game design. Rick Priestley, the creator of Warhammer 40k, is a designer that loves big, impactful dice rolls in his war games. And this new rule, this needing a 5+ in order to respawn your units, it sort of echoes that style of design. But I think it totally misses the mark. If you play one of Priestley's more recent games like Bolt Action, you'll find that you're constantly making rules where on a 6, something incredible happens. If you've rolled the maximum number possible, it's amazing. You've blown up an entire squad of the enemy. But if you roll a 1, if you roll the lowest possible number, something disastrous happens. Everything is on fire. Oh God, how are you going to survive? The rules in his games are impactful for sure, and they're swingy, but they balance each other out because everyone is making them all of the time. You'll get some that are great, you'll get some that are bad. Your opponent will get some that are great, and your opponent will get some that are bad. And some people love this game design style, and some people hate it. But at least it's coherent, and there's an intentionality behind it. In contrast, this army rule has no upside. It's just all downside. On the one hand, if I roll badly, then I get nothing. It's a feels bad moment. I roll a die and nothing happens. And in the unlikely event that I roll well and I get a 5+ and my unit respawns, then I get to use my army rule? It's anti-fun, and it feels like a knee-jerk reaction leading to games determined by a couple of dice rolls, all because Games Workshop don't know how to playtest. The army rule is no longer reliable, and it's no longer fun to engage with, and this has totally killed my favorite faction for me. So it's a little bit of a pity that I've been working so fervently over the last few months on my massive Genestealer cultist army. I guess they're just going back into storage. And honestly, it does feel really like a knee-jerk reaction. It wasn't thought out very well. But perhaps I shouldn't be surprised. And to be frank, all of 10th edition has felt like a bit of an undercooked knee-jerk reaction. Basically, at this stage, I feel like I'm playing the beta. And if you want to see what I mean about that, then check out this video here. And if you want to support critical content examining topical issues in tabletop gaming, then please check out my Patreon. You'll also get bonus videos, hangout live streams, and access to a friendly wargame hobby community. There's a link in the description of this video, and a huge thanks to my patrons, especially CryptoKev, Novani, and Travis Hunter. Thank you so much, guys, and I'll catch y'all next time. Bye-bye.